They move through the void like silent predators, their hulls darker than the vacuum they carve through. No banners, no heraldry, no vox traffic that might betray their course. To most of the Imperium's billions, the black ships are myths, ghost vessels whispered about in catechisms meant to frighten children into obedience. Yet, for those who have seen them breach orbit, who have felt the sky darken as their shadow swallowed the sun, the memory never fades. They are not fleets of conquest, nor crusades of faith. They are collectors, and what they come to collect is not gold or relics or the spoils of war, but souls. Psychers, the damned and the gifted alike, harvested by decree of the Golden Throne itself. Where they go, silence follows, and behind that silence, only the echoes of screams remain. But beneath the official litanies and the sanctioned truths, there are older stories, rumors of what truly happens within those blackened holds, of what the Emperor demands, and of the price the galaxy must pay so that his light might continue to burn. The first sound was not thunder, though that was what the villagers believed it to be. It was lower, deeper, a vibration that trembled through the soil and climbed the bones like the whisper of something vast stirring beyond sight. The air itself seemed to tense, charged with a static that made hair stand on end. Beneath the ochre haze of the evening sky, the people of Vera's Reach stopped their work and turned their eyes upward. The wind had died. The manufactorum chimneys no longer breathed. For the first time in living memory, even the crows refused to fly. Somewhere, a mother pulled her child close and crossed herself in the sign of the Aquila. Somewhere else, a preacher's voice broke mid-hymn. Then, through the clouds, the black ship appeared. It was immense, larger than any vessel the world had ever seen. Its hull layered in plates of night so dense it seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. There were no markings, no heraldic banners, no imperial sigils. Only the faint shimmer of void shields rippling like heat around its flanks. As it broke the upper atmosphere, the sound deepened to a steady hum that felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The elders knew what it was before the name was spoken. They had heard of these ships in the sermons of the Schola, in the fearful tales whispered by the old and the drunk, the vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the collectors of psychers, the Emperor's harvesters. No one moved as it descended. Even the wind dared not intrude upon that silence. The air reeked faintly of ozone, and the sky bled into twilight though the sun had not yet set. As the ship drew closer, its engines dimmed to a low chant, a mechanical litany that seemed half machine, half hymn. Every sound it made felt alive, deliberate. The governor's palace lit its warning beacons, and from the hills the Vox towers began transmitting coded prayers of compliance to orbit. None were answered. By nightfall, the entire population had gathered in the square. Lines of the local Astra Militarum garrison stood to either side, lace guns held but not raised. The commissar's voice carried through the chill air, commanding calm, obedience, faith. But his words were brittle things, swallowed by the ship's growing presence. When the landing thrusters finally ignited, a column of dust rose high enough to blot out the stars. Through it, shapes emerged. Tall, robed figures bearing staves crowned with sensor arrays and relic wards. Their faces were masked in bronze and glass, their eyes hidden behind lenses that flickered faintly with runes of sanction. Sanctioned psychers, some whispered, soulbinders, the Emperor's chosen. At their center walked a figure clad in carapace armor the color of ash, the Imperial Aquila engraved across his breastplate in tarnished gold. A rosette of the Astra Telepathica gleamed faintly on his collar. He carried no weapon, yet the soldiers stepped back as he passed, instinctively lowering their eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but absolute, cutting through the murmuring crowd like a blade through smoke. "By decree of the Master of Mankind," he said, "all registered psychers, seers, and those afflicted by the mark of the warp are to present themselves for collection. Compliance is faith. Resistance is heresy. No one dared to breathe. The words were ancient, ritualistic, recited as if from memory older than the stars. The crowd remained still until, from the far end of the square, a single figure stepped forward. A young woman, no older than 20, her wrists trembling, her eyes bright with tears. She held a data slate, the official notice of her sanction. Her mother followed a few paces behind, whispering prayers, her voice breaking with each syllable. The girl's name was Elira Voss, though few would remember it after that night. She was the first to walk the path into the Black Ship's shadow. The air rippled as the telepathica officer raised his hand. Two soulbinders stepped forward, chanting under their breath, their voices overlapping in a language no one understood. When they reached Elira, she flinched but did not flee. They touched the tips of their staves to her temples, and for a moment the air shimmered. The smell of ozone deepened, the light dimmed, and then she was gone. No sound, no trace, just the faint scent of burned air and the echo of her mother's cry. One by one, others followed. Some went quietly, clutching their sanction slips as though faith alone could shield them. Others had to be dragged, screaming prayers or curses. The crowd watched in silence, afraid to intervene, afraid even to blink. They knew the truth whispered behind every imperial catechism, that psychers were both the Emperor's gift and his greatest curse. They were the power that fueled his throne, and the danger that could undo reality itself. Above them, the Black Ship waited, vast and patient, its engines pulsing like the slow heartbeat of a god. When the last of the chosen had been taken, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise that had come before. The air seemed hollow, the kind of quiet that only exists after something sacred or terrible has passed through. The villagers began to disperse, their faces pale, their eyes darting toward the heavens as though expecting the ship to turn its gaze upon them next. But it did not move. The Black Ship remained poised above the city, suspended in the atmosphere, its hull glimmering faintly in the reflected fire of its own engines. It watched, or perhaps it listened. That night, the fires in the settlement were kept low. No songs were sung, no prayers were offered aloud. Fear had replaced piety, and even the priests of the ecclesiarchy spoke only in whispers. In the governor's palace, a meeting convened, hushed and frantic. The governor, his face glistening with the sheen of anxiety, demanded to know when the ship would depart. None could answer. The Vox links to orbit remained dead. The telepathica delegation had taken up residence within the palace chapel, sealing the doors with wards and servo locks that hissed with the hum of psychic containment. The guards stationed outside swore they could hear voices within, low, rhythmic, not entirely human. By the third night, the dreams began. They came to the psychers who had not yet been found, those who had hidden their curse from the Administratum for fear of collection. They saw the ship in their sleep, saw its corridors alive with movement, shapes without faces passing through mist, whispering in tongues made of static and breath. Some awoke screaming, bleeding from the nose and ears. Others never awoke at all. In the morning, the soulbinders were dispatched again, guided by the astropath's silent command. They moved through the alleys like specters, their staves humming faintly as they sought the hidden mines that had flared too brightly in the night. None resisted for long. The air around them thickened with unseen weight, bending sound and light alike. and when they left, the houses were empty. Illyra's mother, Marion, had not spoken since her daughter's departure. She wandered the square each dawn, her hands raw from clutching the Aquila until the edges cut her palms. On the fourth day, she saw something that froze her heart. A figure standing in the mists beyond the city's perimeter, framed against the glow of the ship above. It looked like her daughter. Same height, same braid, same slight tilt of the head when listening. But the figure did not move like Illyra. It swayed, too fluid, like something remembering how to walk. Marion ran to her, calling her name, but as she drew near, the figure turned and dissolved into a shimmer of gold dust, vanishing with a soft hiss. When the soulbinders arrived, they found her kneeling in the dirt, whispering that she had seen her child's soul returning home. The next morning, a proclamation was broadcast from the ship itself. The Vox carried the voice of the telepathica officer, calm, measured, merciless. The Emperor's harvest is incomplete. All must be rendered unto his light. There can be no shadow where the Master's gaze falls. The words repeated every hour, each iteration slightly distorted, as though something else were speaking through the same channel. Some claimed to hear another voice beneath his, deeper, older. The soldiers stationed at the comm tower began to refuse their shifts, muttering of hearing their own names whispered from the static. Then, without warning, the black ship stirred. Its engines flared and the night turned white. The ground quaked, buildings shuddered, and from the upper spires of the governor's palace, stained glass windows depicting the Emperor's ascension shattered in radiant bursts. The villagers fell to their knees, clutching their ears as the hum built into a thunderous crescendo. And then, silence. The ship lifted, rising slowly, through the mist, through the clouds, until its form was little more than a dark silhouette swallowed by the void. The people dared not cheer, dared not sigh in relief. They simply stood, staring at the heavens until the last trace of its shadow faded from the clouds. In the days that followed, Imperial records would state that 137 psychers were taken from Vera's reach. The official logs noted no casualties, no irregularities, no heresy. The Administratum's report closed with the same phrase it had used 1,000 times before. The Emperor protects. But among the surviving citizens, the stories changed. They spoke of the nights when the stars pulsed with unnatural light, of the dreams that lingered long after the ship was gone. Some said they could still hear the humming in the wind if they listened closely enough. And in the silent corners of the chapel, where the telepathica had performed their rites, the scent of ozone never fully faded. For the Imperium, it was just another harvest. For those left behind, it was a visitation, a reminder that the Emperor's gaze did not bless, it consumed. Far above, in the cold emptiness of the void, the black ship turned its prow toward another world, its engines whispering their endless hymn. Days became weeks, and the memory of the black ship settled over Vera's reach like ash. The city resumed its rhythms, but the cadence was wrong, as if some essential heartbeat had been taken with those who were gone. The manufactorums reopened, their furnaces groaning with new purpose, yet even the roar of promethium-fed fires could not drive away the silence that lingered in every corner. The ecclesiarchy declared a day of sanctification, urging the people to give thanks that the Emperor had spared them, but few attended. The priests spoke with louder voices, desperate to fill the hollowness that followed. Only the children seemed untouched, running through the cracked plazas, their laughter strange and echoing, unaware of what the shadow had stolen from their parents. Beneath the surface of the world, deep in the Vox tunnels that fed the orbital arrays, a different kind of silence grew. The adepts who maintained the systems began to report malfunctions, flickers in the Auspex readings, fragments of whispers caught in the signal bands. Some claimed to hear voices when they tuned the receivers to deep-range frequencies. Not the usual distortion of cosmic radiation, but words. Pleas. Prayers. 1. A young technomancer named Kassan recorded a signal he swore bore the timbre of human speech. When the magos overseeing the installation examined it, his face drained of color. He deleted the recording and sealed the chamber, declaring it sanctified by decree. But those who had heard it before he purged the files could not forget. The voice had been repeating a single phrase over and over. He is awake, and we are burning. Rumor spread fast on Vera's reach. Administratum scribes called it superstition, a symptom of mass hysteria following the harvest. Yet those who lived closest to the landing site knew better. The ground there still pulsed faintly at night, as though something beneath the crust was remembering the weight of the ship. Crows gathered there in unnatural numbers, tearing at the soil, their eyes pale and glassy. The locals avoided the area, marking it with purity seals and the bones of small animals. The priests called it blasphemy. The people called it survival. It was Marion Voss who first claimed to see the lights. They came to her window on the 21st night after the ship's departure, small and golden, moving like embers drifting through the air. She thought they were spirits. Perhaps her daughter's soul returned to say farewell. But when she tried to touch them, they sank into her skin, burning faintly before vanishing. The next morning, she woke with her eyes clouded white and her voice gone. The medici said her mind had shattered under grief. The priests said she had been touched by the Emperor's mercy. Yet those who looked into her empty eyes swore they saw stars. By the second month, the dreams had returned, not to the hidden psychers, for there were none left, but to the ordinary people. Farmers, soldiers, scribes, they all began to dream of the void. In their sleep, they floated through corridors of black metal, endless and cold. They heard chanting, saw robed figures bowing before altars that wept light. And at the heart of it all, a throne of bone and gold, its occupant a silhouette of blinding radiance. They awoke, trembling, eyes bleeding, unable to speak of what they had seen. The governor ordered the dream suppressed through prayer and narcotics. It changed nothing. The visions persisted, growing stronger each night, as if the ship's shadow had never left. The telepathica had departed, yet their presence lingered in the architecture itself. Vox relays hummed with static shaped like words. Cogitators printed fragments of code in high Gothic prayers. The light must feed, the light must never rest. Even the servitors twitched in their alcoves, their augmetic eyes flickering as though receiving unseen transmissions. The Mechanicus priests began to speak of resonance, of psychic residue burned into the fabric of the world. But their explanations did little to quiet the fear, and so the people of Vera's Reach did what humanity always does when faced with the inexplicable. They built shrines. They burned candles at the edges of the landing site, whispering prayers that blended awe with terror. They offered trinkets, small pieces of themselves, hair, blood, teeth, hoping the gesture would keep the nightmares away. Some swore they could hear replies whispered through the flames. The priests of the ecclesiarchy sanctioned none of it, yet even they began to falter in their certainty. Faith is brittle when silence answers every prayer. Then, one night, the stars vanished. No one saw it happen. One moment, the heavens above the settlement burned with their usual clarity. The next, they were gone, swallowed by darkness so complete it seemed as though the void itself had drawn closer. The people screamed, the auspex arrays flared, and the governor's palace was thrown into chaos. The Mechanicus confirmed the impossible. There was no stellar obstruction, no storm, no warp anomaly. The stars themselves had simply ceased to shine. For 3 nights, the void above Vera's reach remained utterly black, until, on the 4th dawn, they returned, all except one. The brightest star in the constellation of the Emperor's crown was missing. In its place hung a faint smudge of moving shadow. To the priests, it was a test of faith. To the soldiers, a warning. But to those who had seen the black ship, there was only one thought, unspoken but shared in every heart. It was watching them still. By the 43rd day after the ship's departure, the silence had become its own kind of tyranny. It clung to the city like a fog that never lifted, soaking into the cracks of the hab blocks, settling on the skin of every living thing. No laughter carried through the Manufactorum corridors anymore, no hymns echoed through the basilica domes. Even the governor's proclamations, once bellowed with the fervor of duty, had grown thin, perfunctory, as though the man himself no longer believed in the words he spoke. The people went through their routines with mechanical precision, the same as the servitors who labored beside them, both slaves to programming of different kinds. Faith had become just another habit, performed without conviction. The shadow of the black ship had never truly left. It lingered in every unspoken thought, every prayer that went unanswered. It was the children who began to change first. They spoke of voices in the air, of figures drifting through the streets at night. Some claimed that the clouds still bore the shape of the ship's silhouette, hidden in plain sight waiting. The priests called it imagination, corrupted by fear. But one night a patrolman found a group of them standing on the landing site, their eyes wide and unfocused, faces turned to the sky. They were whispering in unison, a low, rhythmic murmur that rose and fell like the tides. When he approached, they turned to him as one and smiled. Their eyes burned with pale gold light. He fired his laser gun without hesitation, his hand shaking so violently that the shots went wild. By the time reinforcements arrived, the children were gone. Only their footprints remained, burned into the soil as if by fire. The following week, the Adeptus Arbites blockaded the site. A full platoon of enforcers in black carapace armor surrounded the perimeter, their vox grills hissing with clipped commands. The governor issued a planetary alert, forbidding all travel within the zone. Yet the dreams continued, spreading like infection. Some awoke screaming the names of the missing. Others woke blind. A few never woke at all, their bodies found twisted in unnatural positions, eyes wide as if still staring at something beyond sight. The Medici called it mass psychosis. The ecclesiarchy called it possession. The Magos biologist dissected the dead and found nothing but evidence of cardiac arrest. But among the people, a different word spread. A word older than any decree: the calling. Rumor said that once a world was touched by the shadow of the black ships, it was never truly free. That each harvest left behind an echo, a fragment of the warp that lingered in the soil and the mind. The Telepathica denied it, of course. The Emperor's will, they said, left no stain. But to those who had watched their loved ones vanish into that cold light, the lie was too thin to hold. Fear turned to superstition, and superstition turned to ritual. The shrines at the edge of the landing site grew taller, the offerings stranger. Blood painted the stones in patterns no priest had sanctioned. The soldiers sent to dismantle them began to disappear. Some were found wandering miles from the city, muttering prayers to an unseen master. Others were simply never found at all. On the 60th night, the governor vanished. His chambers were sealed from within, the locks unbroken, the guards stationed outside reporting no sound. When the door was forced open at dawn, his body was gone, but the words, "He is listening," had been burned into the wall above his desk, carved deep by a heat that had melted the plasteel beneath. The Adeptus Arbites declared it sabotage, but there was no trace of entry, no evidence of human interference. For the first time, even the soldiers began to pray. At dusk, a storm rose from the horizon, unnatural, silent, its lightning striking upward into the clouds instead of down. The people fled to the chapels, clutching candles and icons while the skies churned like boiling iron. And then, through the roiling clouds, something vast began to form. It wasn't the black ship, not exactly, but the shape was close enough to wrench screams from every throat. A silhouette of darkness and fire stretched across the heavens. Its edges rippled, dissolving and reforming, as if the void itself were trying to remember the shape of what it once carried. The storm broke in a flash of crimson light, and for one impossible moment, the people swore they saw faces within the clouds, thousands of them, eyes wide, mouths open in a collective scream that no sound could carry. When the light faded, the storm was gone. The air was clear, the stars visible again. But at the heart of the city, where the landing site had once glowed faintly with the memory of the ship, there was now only a crater. Within it, a single object lay half buried in ash. A data slate, old and blackened, its surface cracked by heat. When the Mechanicus recovered it, they found it still functional, its machine spirit weak but intact. The last recorded entry was a transmission log from the telepathica officer who had led the harvest. The message was fragmented, distorted by static, but one line remained clear enough to read, "The Emperor's light demands more than we can give, yet we give and give again." The Magos ordered the slate destroyed. It was said to be heretical, its data a corruption of sanctioned scripture. But rumor claimed that before he purged it, he read one final entry that no one else ever saw. A single phrase repeated endlessly, as though written by a dying machine or a mind unraveling under revelation. "He is not sleeping." The people of Vera's Reach would never see the black ship again. But in every hum of their generators, in every echo of the wind through the hollow manufactorum halls, the memory lived on. The harvest had ended, but the shadow it cast had only begun to spread. And far beyond, in the cold expanse of the void, where the stars gleamed like watchful eyes, the black ship continued its silent voyage, its holds filled with the bound, the burning, and the faithful. There is no sunrise in the void, only the endless cold glow of starlight, diffused across the armored hulls of ships that move without sound or mercy. Within the belly of one such vessel, the hum of the black ship. Mercy of his silence reverberated like the breath of a sleeping giant. The decks were dark, lined with conduits that pulsed faintly with blue light. Air recyclers whispered through the vents, filtering the breath of thousands who would never see another world again. It smelled of oil, ozone, and the faint tang of sanctified incense, a fragrance meant to ward off the stink of fear and sweat, though it failed miserably. Fear was everywhere. It soaked the metal itself. The psychers were kept in rows of cells stretching for kilometers, each sealed behind adamantium grills, etched with sigils of binding and wards of null light. The corridors were dim, illuminated only by lumen strips that flickered intermittently, as though the ship itself resented shedding light upon what it carried. Inside each cell, the condemned whispered, muttered, screamed, or simply sat in silence, their minds too fractured to form coherent thought. Chains of psychoreactive iron bound their wrists and throats, connected to the walls by veins of conduit that fed into the ship's core. Each chain hummed faintly with containment fields. It was not to keep them from escaping, it was to keep them from dreaming. servitors patrolled the corridors in ceaseless rhythm. They were once human, but their eyes were glass now, their mouths sealed by surgical iron. Their bodies moved with mechanical grace, bearing trays of nutrient paste and recycled water to each cell. When they entered, the psychers would recoil, for even in their madness they knew what those things truly were: extensions of the ship, eyes of the machine god, and perhaps more than that. One servitor in particular, designation C-1448, had begun to twitch between movements. Its Vox unit emitted low bursts of static, irregular, like breath stifled in the throat. It did not know why. Servitors do not know. But somewhere in the remains of its human cortex, a spark had awoken. A fragment of memory that should have been burned away during lobotomization. C-1448 remembered the smell of dust, the sound of wind moving through a market, the warmth of a sun it could no longer name. And above all, it remembered a voice, a young woman's voice, saying, "Do not be afraid." It didn't know who she was or why her words haunted the echoing chambers of its skull. All it knew was that when it passed cell 339, something stirred inside its dying flesh. The occupant of 339 was not like the others. She sat upright, eyes open, her gaze fixed on the faint light that bled through the ceiling grills. Her name, recorded once in the ship's manifest, and now almost erased by static corruption, had been Illyra Voss. Her chains were tighter than most, each cuff marked with double wards. A residual glow shimmered around her skin, faint but constant, as though her body could not fully contain the energy that swelled within. The servitor paused before her cell, tray balanced in shaking hands. Her head turned slowly, her eyes meeting the blank lenses of its face. For a moment, neither moved. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "You dream, don't you?" The servitor froze. Its protocols screamed denial, error, purge. But deep within its corrupted data stack, something flickered, a pulse like a heartbeat. Static filled its auditory sensors. She smiled faintly, as though she had heard the answer without needing sound. "They made you forget," she said. "But the ship remembers. It keeps every voice it has ever taken." Her words lingered as the servitor turned away, movements jerky and uneven. Behind it, the hum of the ship deepened, and the faint blue light of the conduits flared brighter, as if responding to her voice. Across the entire hold, psychers began to stir. Some whimpered, others wept, and one began to laugh. A hollow, broken sound that carried down the length of the corridor. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropping several degrees. Ice began to form along the edges of the cell doors, glittering faintly in the artificial light. Above, in the command sanctum, the ship's navigator stirred from his trance. His eyes, black as ink, opened within the glowing chamber of the Geller field generator. He felt the disturbance ripple through the warp like a shiver, a brief distortion in the veil. A lesser mind would have ignored it, but he was old, and the void had taught him to listen to anomalies. He turned his attention inward, following the tremor to its source. For a fleeting instant he saw her, cell 339, a girl wrapped in light, her mind flickering like a candle in a storm. "Another awakening," he murmured, "another fire to be, quenched." He reached for the Vox relay and spoke a single word to the bridge crew. "Containment." Below decks, klaxons began to wail. The sound of the alarms rolled through the ship like a storm front, low, pulsing, alive. Red lumen strips flickered to life along the corridor walls, bathing everything in a trembling glow that turned sweat into blood and fear into fire. Servitors locked in maintenance alcoves shuddered awake as emergency protocols overrode their routines, limbs whirring with renewed purpose. From the far end of the containment hold came the clatter of armored boots, the enforcers of the Black Ship's order, the Soul Guard. They moved in formation, 12 figures encased in black ceramite, their armor etched with sigils of protection and reinforced with psychic dampeners that hummed softly in the red light. Each bore a staff weapon, the head carved into the shape of a winged skull crowned with wards. Their leader, Inquisitorial Envoy Arctan Valen, walked at the center, his face hidden behind a respirator mask, his voice sharp through the vox. Containment breach, level 3, seal sections Gamma through Delta, null fields to maximum. The air answered him with static, the voice of the ship itself vibrating through every bulkhead. It was not language, not truly, but something older, a resonance of fear pressed into metal. The Soul Guard moved faster. In cell 339, Illyra Voss sat motionless, eyes still fixed on the ceiling. The hum around her had changed, deeper now, more insistent. The air vibrated against her skin, as though the void itself was pressing its ear to the ship to listen. She didn't know how she knew, but she could feel them, the other psychers, screaming in the distance, their pain reverberating through her skull like the echoes of a dying choir. Their thoughts collided, tangled, screamed, and fractured into colors and sensations that made no sense. Yet, within the madness, there was structure, a rhythm, a pulse. She whispered the words before she even understood what they meant. "He is not sleeping." Her breath fogged the air, and the temperature dropped again. Frost crept across the walls like veins of glass, shimmering faintly in the light. The runes along her chains flickered, the containment field straining as though resisting a force it could no longer fully comprehend. Sparks leapt from the sigil plates, dancing across the floor like fireflies. Somewhere above her, the ship groaned. Servitor C-1448 had not moved since the alarms began. Its limbs twitched in irregular rhythm, and data overflow warnings filled its internal logs. The image of her face burned against the static of its decayed memory banks, fusing with the ghost of the voice it had carried for so long. "Do not be afraid," the words looped endlessly, interlaced with her own. The machine's programming tried to suppress it, but the signal spread like infection through the ship's servitor network. Monitors flared with bursts of white noise. Data slates printed nonsense symbols that twisted into faces and prayers. The ship was waking. Down in the command sanctum, the navigator's chamber flared with sudden light. His attendants, blindfolded adepts and robed astropaths, fell to their knees as the Geller field flickered. One of them cried out that the ship's wards were resonating with a secondary pattern, something alive within the containment decks. Valen's voice crackled through the intercom, sharp and cold. "Purge sequence authorized. Flood the hold with inhibitor gas." The adepts obeyed. Massive vents opened along the ceilings of the psyker containment bays, exhaling a translucent mist that shimmered faintly under the lumen glow. The gas carried the faint scent of copper and incense, psychic suppressant compounds mixed with vaporized blessed oils. Most of the psychers fell silent within moments, their screams cut off as the numbing chill seeped into their lungs. Others convulsed violently, their powers sparking one last time before fading, but not Illyra. The mist swirled around her, refused to touch her skin, spinning instead in a perfect circle as though drawn by some unseen gravity. Her eyes burned white. She raised her head and spoke, not in defiance, not in rage, but in prayer. "I can see him." The lights failed. The ship plunged into darkness, so complete it seemed to erase sound. Even the hum of the reactors stilled. The Soul Guard stopped mid-step, weapons raised but useless, their vox links erupting in static. A voice, not Elira's, not human, filled the black. "Do you hear it?" it asked. The heartbeat of the dying god? Panic shattered discipline. Bolters flared, muzzle flashes illuminating glimpses of terror. Figures in the dark that weren't there when the lights were on. Hands pressed against the inside of sealed cell doors. Eyes that burned through armor. The corridor erupted into chaos, screams layered with mechanical howls as the servitors turned, their limbs contorting, guided by commands no human had given. And then, as swiftly as it began, the noise ceased. The lights stuttered back to life, flickering uncertainly. The gas had cleared. The cells stood silent once more. Every door remained sealed. The Soul Guard were gone. Only their weapons and armor lay scattered along the corridor, smoking gently, as if they had been hollowed out from within. In the command sanctum, Valen's voice was a whisper. "Containment restored," he said, though his hands trembled. No one questioned the lie. They never did. Far below, in the quiet of cell 339, Elira Voss closed her eyes and smiled faintly. Her chains no longer hummed. The ship had stopped resisting her. It was listening. Hours passed, though on a black ship time had little meaning. The void outside offered no dawn or dusk. No measure but the rhythm of machinery and the occasional distant toll of a service bell echoing from the sanctum decks. The mercy of his silence drifted through that endless dark, scarred by what it had endured. On the bridge, the senior officers spoke in clipped tones, voices drained of emotion. Each syllable wrapped in ritual, as if words alone might hold the ship together. They avoided looking at the Auspex readings too long. Every scan of the lower decks came back wrong. Energy spikes where there should be none, voices on frequencies that did not exist. One Vox officer claimed he heard prayer chants encoded in the radiation noise. He was relieved of duty and sent to the infirmary, though the others knew he wasn't lying. No one lied aboard the Mercy, not anymore. Down below, in the bowels of the ship, the servitors moved differently now. They no longer followed their circuits with mechanical precision. Their pacing had become rhythmic, almost ritualistic. When one halted, the others mirrored it. When one twitched, the others shuddered in response. From the overhead pipes, condensation dripped in measured intervals that formed a pulse. The hum of the ship had changed tone. It was no longer the mechanical drone of reactors. It was softer, heavier. It sounded like breathing. C-1448 wandered without purpose, its tray discarded, its visual sensors flickering in and out. The corrupted loops in its cortex had spread, forming a network of ghost data that connected it to every other servitor aboard. It didn't understand what it was becoming, only that it was feeling pain, warmth, hunger. Most of all, it felt the pull, the gravitational draw of cell 339. It moved toward it without conscious command, its iron feet clanging softly against the deck. When it reached the door, it paused, head tilting as though listening to something deep within the metal. The voice that came through was not sound, but thought. A whisper pressed directly into what remained of its mind. "You remember me." The servitor froze, systems spiking with feedback. Fragments of memory erupted across its neural grid. The face of a young woman laughing beneath a golden sky, the smell of smoke, the fear of being taken. Then another flash. Surgical lights, the hiss of saws, voices reciting prayers as metal replaced flesh. Its internal speakers clicked on unbidden, emitting a single broken word. "Why?" Elira's eyes opened. Light poured from them, golden and steady. "Because you were there," she said. "Because you saw what they did, and they could not erase it all. You carried the truth even when they made you hollow." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with something like pity. you remember the harvest. C-1448's logs flickered. Images of men and women bound in chains. Lines of prisoners marched through the dust. The faces of the telepathica clerics as they selected their quotas. It remembered carrying the young woman to the shuttle, her tears falling onto its metal arm. It had been there when she was loaded aboard, silent, obedient. It had been there when the ship sealed her fate. Now, for the first time since that day, it disobeyed. With a sound like thunder, the servitor tore its restraint cables from the wall. Sparks rained from the junction points, lighting the corridor in flares of white fire. It slammed its mechanical arm into the control console of cell 339. The door hissed, then groaned, then cracked open as the wards flared and died. Elira stepped forward, the remnants of her chains falling away like dust. The air around her shimmered with light so fierce it hurt the sensors to perceive. But the servitor didn't recoil. It fell to one knee. "Do not kneel," she whispered, placing her hand on its head. "Stand and see what they have hidden." The ship screamed. Every lumen flickered to life. Every siren blared. Doors sealed across the decks as the containment alarms reached their highest setting. From the bridge, Valen bellowed orders to the machine spirits, his voice breaking through static. "Seal the hold. Activate purge sequence, now!" The navigator tried to intercede, his own voice trembling. "Wait, the Geller field, if we purge now..." But it was too late. Valen struck the rune. The world erupted. Flame vented through the ducts. Liquid fire surging across the containment decks. The air became a furnace, the walls glowing with heat. Psychers screamed as their cells ignited, the psychic residue of their deaths twisting into visible shapes. Faces of light, mouths open in soundless agony. The servitors convulsed, their circuits overloading as the temperature rose. But in the heart of the inferno, Elira stood untouched. The fire bent around her, flowing like water diverted by an unseen hand. C-1448 collapsed, systems failing, its vision narrowing to a tunnel of golden light. The last thing it saw was her reaching out, her lips moving in words it could no longer hear. Then, its consciousness went dark, its data wiped clean. Yet, somewhere in the machine's remains, a faint signal persisted, transmitting endlessly through the ship's veins. He is not sleeping, he is calling. Above, the bridge deck shook as the firestorm subsided. Valen's hands gripped the command rail, knuckles white, his eyes staring into the burning decks below through the auger feed. The entire lower hold was ash, the psychers gone, their essence absorbed into the void. He felt a momentary wave of relief, then dread. The energy readings were rising again, not fading, rising. A whisper slid through the ship's vox like oil. "You cannot burn what was never born in flesh." The navigator turned pale. "She's in the conduits," he whispered. "She's everywhere." The void, outside the mercy of his silence, seemed to press closer now, like a living thing drawn by scent. The ship's external shields rippled with auric light, their integrity fields spasming as waves of unseen energy rolled across the hull. The void sensors registered no enemy presence, no warp surge, no gravitational anomaly. And yet the ship was moving, its engines burning with power no one had commanded. The helm thralls lay dead in their sockets, their augmetic eyes still wide and glowing, as if staring into something only they could see. On the bridge, Arcton Valen's hands trembled as he issued commands the ship refused to obey. Override auxiliary systems, engage manual control. No response. Vox the fleet beacon, any channel. Only static. He turned to the navigator's chamber, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Guide us out of this." But the navigator was beyond speech. His third eye bled black ichor, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. the warp had turned inward, collapsing upon his consciousness. The chart screens flickered with shapes that weren't maps, but veins of light crawling through the dark. Patterns that moved as if alive. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else began to laugh. Down in the smoldering decks below, the ship's rebirth continued. The containment level had become a cathedral of ruin. Walls glowed faintly where fire had melted them smooth. The metal now fused into grotesque shapes that resembled bone and flesh. The air vibrated with the residue of countless minds burned to ash. From those ashes rose light, small sparks drifting like dust motes through the corridor, coalescing around one figure who stood at the center of it all. Illyra Voss. Her feet left faint impressions of gold where she walked, and the remnants of her chains floated weightlessly behind her like ribbons. Her body was unchanged, yet her presence filled the space like a storm restrained. Her eyes glowed not white now, but the dull gold of ancient statues. She was breathing slowly, as though listening to something vast and far away, and then she spoke. Not to the ship, but through it. Your silence was never his will. The words reverberated through every deck, echoing down corridors, through vox lines, into the bones of the crew. Even those who could not hear felt them. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads. Others screamed and fired into the air, desperate to drown the voice out. On the bridge, every display flared with static symbols, the same phrase repeating in 1,000 dialects, cycling through binary, Gothic, and datascript alike. The light must feed. Volin shouted for his guards to rally, but half of them had already turned their weapons on themselves, eyes blank with awe or terror. The remaining few staggered to the bridge doors, locking them shut. Volin moved to the command console and activated the intership vox, his voice cracking through the distortion. By authority of the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition, I command you, stand down. There was no reply. Instead, the vox channels filled with the sound of breathing, slow, deep, and impossible. Too vast to belong to any single living being. It filled the lungs of the ship itself. The lumen strips dimmed and brightened in rhythm with that breathing. The Mercy was alive. Illyra moved through the corridors, the servitors rising behind her in mechanical reverence. Their faces were expressionless, their movements synchronized. The circuits within their bodies pulsed with golden light. She passed them without speaking. She did not need to. The ship heard her. The walls parted, bulkheads retracting as though welcoming her path. She came to the heart of the vessel, the psychic-focusing core, where the harvested souls of the dead were fed into the Emperor's light, their energy converted into the sustaining beacon that guided the fleets of the Imperium through the void. The chamber pulsed, alive with tortured sound. Thousands of containment orbs hung in the air like stars, each holding the faint shimmer of a dying soul. The light within them flickered weakly, whispering prayers that were half machine, half memory. Illyra raised her hand, and the orbs stilled. The ship shuddered. "They told us we were chosen," she whispered, voice soft but carrying through every conduit. "They said our lives would become light for the master of mankind. But the truth is this." She paused, her gaze unfocused, eyes seeing beyond metal, beyond distance, into the warp's endless dark. "The light does not set us free. It devours us." Her words ignited the air. The containment orbs flared, each one bursting in a flash of gold and blue. The energy within them poured outward, weaving through the chamber like rivers of burning silk. The ship roared, systems failing, decks trembling as psychic energy overloaded every circuit. The void shields flared one last time before collapsing entirely. Outside, the warp rippled. It was as if the mercy of his silence had become a beacon, not of light, but of awakening. On the bridge, the navigator's corpse twitched, his third eye snapping open with blinding radiance. Valen stumbled back as the chamber filled with spectral figures, their forms shifting between light and shadow, their faces human but wrong, too symmetrical, too knowing. They looked at him and spoke in unison. She has seen the truth. Valen's faith wavered for the first time in decades. Blasphemy, he whispered, though the word tasted hollow. You serve him by dying. You serve him by feeding the flame. One of the specters smiled. Do you know what burns in that flame, Inquisitor? You do. You've seen it in your dreams. Valen raised his bolt pistol, firing into the air, the shells tearing through light and nothingness alike. The specters vanished, but the sound of their laughter followed him long after. He turned to the viewing port, eyes widening. The warp outside had changed color. It was no longer the shifting spectrum of madness and stars. It was gold, radiant and still. The shape of a man, vast and radiant, flickered across its surface for one impossible heartbeat. And then the ship began to fall. The descent was soundless at first. A shudder felt through bone and blood rather than heard. The mercy of his silence pitched downward into the Imperium, its hull aflame with psychic energy, its engines locked in full drive though no living hand touched the controls. The stars outside warped into trails of molten gold, cascading into oblivion. Gravity failed. Loose fragments of steel and bone floated upward, caught in invisible eddies that spun through the air like the currents of some unseen ocean. The crew screamed prayers, but their words dissolved into static, devoured by the roar of the warp. Valen clawed his way to the central dais of the bridge, gripping the relic-wrought console that pulsed under his hands like living flesh. "Stabilize the Geller field," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Do it now." The tech adepts obeyed, slamming their data spikes into the ports, chanting machine cant so fast the words blurred together. But the field refused to form. The generator flared, coughed sparks, and then bloomed outward in a wave of light that ripped half the adepts apart where they stood. Their ashes drifted upward, glowing like embers before vanishing into thin air. Valen's respirator mask was cracked, his lungs burning from smoke and blood. Yet he still tried to speak the words of authority that had once moved armies. By his will, by his will. But the phrase would not finish. The Emperor's name stuck in his throat like glass, because he could feel it now. Something vast stirring beyond the thin membrane of real space. Not a being, not even a will. Something older. It pressed against the ship from all directions, whispering through the metal. Not in malice, but in hunger. It wanted what the ship carried. It wanted the fire that had been stolen from it 10,000 years ago. Below decks, in the heart of the containment core, Elira floated above the deck, her body enveloped in golden light. The chains that had bound her mind were gone. In their place was silence, the kind of silence that exists before sound, before creation itself. Around her, the orbs of harvested souls had burst open, their light threading together into streams that flowed into her chest. Each soul spoke as it merged, their voices a chorus of memory, billions of whispers becoming one note. We were the fuel, we were the light, we were the price. Her eyes opened. No more. With that, she reached out, not with her hands, but with the raw force of her will, and touched the machine at the center of the chamber. It was a construct older than most civilizations, a fusion of sacred technology and psychic conduit, a miniature echo of the Golden Throne itself. For millennia, it had consumed the minds of the damned to keep the Astronomican's faint pulse alive. Now, it shuddered beneath her touch. Gold light spilled from every seam, flooding the corridors, turning metal to glass. On the bridge, the view screens went white. Valen staggered back, eyes wide with awe and terror. The ship's Vox channels came alive, broadcasting the same voice on every frequency, every wavelength of light. It was Elira, but magnified, her tone neither human nor divine, but something that felt like both. "You fed the flame," she said, her voice echoing across 1,000 decks, "but you never asked what it burned." The crew fell to their knees. Some sobbed. Others clawed at their faces, unable to bear the sound. Through the portholes, the warp pulsed brighter. The golden light spread outward from the Mercy, radiating like a beacon that reached across impossible distances. For the briefest moment, every astropath within 100 light-years felt it, the surge of impossible warmth, the sound of a heartbeat deep within the Astronomican itself. Many fell dead where they stood, their skulls smoking, their final expressions serene. Back aboard the Mercy, Valen stumbled forward, blood running from his eyes. "You don't understand," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "You can't take it away. The Emperor's light will die. Humanity will die." Elira's voice came softly in reply. "Then let him wake." The ship convulsed, every deck screaming in metal agony. Valen was thrown to the floor as the hull split open along its spine, light pouring out into the void. From the tear spilled not blood or fire, but souls, thousands, millions, rising like a tide of luminescence. They flowed outward, disappearing into the warp, each one a flicker of consciousness freed from the cycle of consumption. For an instant, the entire ship glowed like a second sun, brighter than anything the human eye could endure. Then, just as suddenly, the light was gone. The Mercy of his silence drifted, broken but whole, her engines dead, her crew silent. The warp outside returned to its endless, churning darkness. Valen awoke amid the ruin. The bridge collapsed around him, the air thick with the stench of burned metal and incense. His Vox crackled once, just once, and through it came a faint, distant whisper. "She walks among the stars now. She will not be silent." He tried to stand, but his legs failed him. Through the shattered viewport, he saw movement, a faint shimmer of gold fading into the black. The last trace of her, gone into the void. He wanted to pray, but the words would not come. The catechisms that had once sustained him felt like ash in his mouth. He sank to his knees, staring at the darkness, and realized that for the first time in his life he could no longer feel the Emperor's light. Only the echo of her voice remained, circling endlessly through the dead Vox channels. He is not sleeping. If the Imperium's secrets draw you in, if you've ever looked upon the stars and wondered what lies hidden between the edicts and the fear, then join us. Subscribe, share this chronicle, and keep your eyes upon the void, because what follows is not mere speculation, but the whispered truth that survives only in fragments of data slates and heretical logs, smuggled out at terrible cost. Every fragment matters. Every truth has a price. There are ships that drift in the void forever. Derelicts whose names are spoken only in the litanies of warning, sung by voidfarers and astropaths. The Mercy of his silence had become one of them. To passing vessels, she was little more than a sensor anomaly, a cold shadow against the glow of distant stars. Her Vox beacons were dead, her Geller field inert, her heat signature barely traceable. Yet those who came too close reported whispers bleeding through their auger arrays, soft at first, then unmistakable. Voices speaking prayers that had no author, in languages no living human could identify. The Adeptus Mechanicus declared her lost, filed among the hundreds of black ships that vanish each century. The Administratum stamped her record closed, but there were some, those who listened between the transmissions of the Astronomicon, who claimed to still hear her heart beating faintly through the Imperium. Inside, she was far from dead. The corridors no longer obeyed the laws of geometry. Staircases twisted into themselves, doors opened onto rooms that should not exist, and every footstep echoed twice, as if the ship were remembering its own movement. The bodies of the crew remained where they had fallen, perfectly preserved, their eyes open, their mouths frozen mid-prayer. Lumen globes flickered with pale gold light, brightening and dimming to the rhythm of some unseen pulse. Down in the lower decks, servitors stood motionless in their alcoves, their augmetic limbs locked in reverent stillness. In the silence, the ship dreamed. Somewhere deep within that labyrinth, Arcton Valen still lived. He had survived through mechanisms even he did not fully understand, perhaps by accident, perhaps by the will of the very thing he once sought to destroy. His armor was cracked, his body frail, his hair gone white from exposure to psychic feedback. Yet his mind remained sharp, honed by decades of indoctrinated faith. He dragged himself through the endless corridors, guided by a single purpose: to reach the core and end whatever had taken root there. The Inquisition did not permit failure, not even in damnation. As he passed through the silent halls, the walls seemed to breathe around him, metal expanding and contracting in slow rhythm. Sometimes he heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing. Only the echo of his own motion. His Vox unit was long dead, yet faint transmissions bled through the static in his ear. At first, they were meaningless bursts of noise, but as he descended deeper into the ship, they began to form words. He is not sleeping. She waits in the chamber. The light remembers. He ignored them. He had to. To listen was to invite madness, and madness was what had claimed the others. He kept moving, each step a recitation of the Emperor's litany of resistance, though the words faltered now and then. His faith had become muscle memory more than conviction. He reached the lower sanctum after what felt like days, or perhaps hours. Time was broken here. The doors that once led to the containment hold were gone, replaced by a vast archway of twisted metal that shimmered faintly in the golden gloom. Beyond it lay the chamber where the psychers had once been stored. It was unrecognizable now. The cell walls had melted into one another, forming a single cavernous space whose floor glowed with faint symbols, shifting and realigning like living scripture. At its center stood the remains of the psychic core, now transformed into something organic, a lattice of light and bone, humming softly with the voices of 1,000 souls. Valen hesitated at the threshold. The air here was warm, almost comforting. He could smell incense, faintly metallic and sweet, the kind used in the chapels of Terra. He knew that smell from childhood, from his first oath before the inquisitorial seal. For a moment, he let himself breathe it in. Then, from the heart of the chamber, a figure began to form. She emerged not from the floor or the light, but from the very air, slowly, as though assembling from memory. Illyra Voss. Her face was calm, her body luminous, her eyes reflecting a light that did not belong to any star. Valen raised his weapon, though his arm trembled. "You should not be," he rasped. "You were unmade, burned, consumed." Her smile was gentle, almost human. "So were you once," she said. Her voice filled the chamber, soft and infinite. "All of you were. The fire that feeds the throne has burned since before memory, and still you call it mercy." He steadied his aim, though his knees buckled beneath the weight of her gaze. "You are blasphemy made flesh. Whatever you've become, it ends now." "Ends," she echoed, and for a moment her light flickered, revealing the shadow of exhaustion beneath. "Nothing ends, Inquisitor. It only echoes." The air trembled, and the chamber responded. The walls rippled with sound, not noise but harmony. Voices layered upon voices, thousands of them rising in perfect unity. It was not the scream of the damned, but the hymn of the remembered. The light grew brighter, until Valen had to shield his eyes. "What do you want?" he shouted above the resonance. She looked at him with a sadness that hollowed the air. To be heard. The sound in the chamber deepened until it became a weight pressing against Volan's ribs. Each note seemed to vibrate through his bones, resonating with something he had forgotten he possessed. A heart that once believed without fear. The walls glowed brighter with every word that passed her lips, the light weaving through the air like threads of molten glass. His weapon trembled in his grip. He had faced demons before, seen horrors beyond sanity, yet none of them had spoken like this. None of them had sounded so human. Illyra drifted closer, her feet never touching the floor. Her radiance pulsed in slow rhythm, matching the faint heartbeat that seemed to echo through the ship itself. When she spoke again, her voice came not only from her mouth but from every surface around them. "Do you remember, Inquisitor, what they told you when you first saw the Golden Throne? Do you remember the smell of oil and prayer, the endless machines breathing beneath the palace? They said you were witnessing his eternal mercy, but mercy is not eternal, it devours to endure." Valen's throat clenched. He remembered. The memory surfaced unbidden, standing as a young acolyte among the custodes, the throne vast before him, its light so blinding that he could not tell whether he was seeing divinity or machinery. The air had been thick with incense, the chant of 10,000 monks shaking the marble halls. He remembered thinking that it looked less like a seat of power and more like a wound that refused to heal. "You dare," he whispered, his voice raw. "You dare to question what has saved humanity for 10 millennia." She tilted her head. Saved or delayed its death? The chamber brightened again. Valen's breath caught in his throat as images began to form within the light. Scenes that hung in the air like reflections on glass. Worlds burning beneath alien suns. Fleets torn apart by the warp. Entire hives swallowed by their own faith. Each vision flickered past in a heartbeat, and in each, a black ship appeared overhead, silent and black as judgment. Psychers marched in chains, flames, screams, light. Always the same, always the harvest. "This is what your salvation feeds," Illyra said. "Every prayer you whisper keeps the pyre burning. Every life taken in his name is a spark to keep the throne alive. Do you not feel the hunger of it? Even now, can you not hear it calling for more?" Volan pressed his hand to his temple. He could hear it, faint beneath her voice, the sound of a slow, endless breathing that filled every shadow. It wasn't her, it wasn't the ship, it was older, deeper. A sound that existed beneath reality itself, the sound of something that could not die because it was never allowed to. He staggered, his faith breaking against the weight of revelation. "You lie," he gasped. "You speak with the tongue of the warp." "I speak with the voice of what it consumes," she replied. Her hand reached toward him, and in that instant he saw the truth. Not as vision, but as memory, raw and undeniable. He saw the faces of the psychers he had ordered collected, heard their cries as they were dragged aboard, smelled the burnt air of their deaths. He saw himself younger, reciting the litany of justification that sanctified their suffering. And behind it all, he saw the Golden Throne again, its light flickering, its master unmoving. He saw the rivers of souls flowing into it, unending, screaming silently as they vanished into brilliance. He fell to his knees. His bolt pistol clattered to the floor, forgotten. Illyra knelt beside him, the light of her body dimming until it was no brighter than a candle flame. "He does not know," she whispered, and her voice trembled with pity. "They told you he sits in silence, watching, guiding, but he cannot hear you. His silence is not will. It is the silence of a man long gone, whose shadow still feeds upon the living." Her words tore at him more deeply than any weapon could have. He had killed for the Emperor, burned worlds, executed innocents, all to preserve the illusion of order. Now, in this hollow, breathing tomb of a ship, he felt that illusion crumble to dust. Still, a fragment of discipline clung to him, stubborn as scar tissue. "Then what are you?" he rasped. "A demon? A fragment of madness? What do you want from me?" Illyra smiled faintly, the kind of smile that exists between mercy and sorrow. "I am the echo of every soul that fed his flame. I am the question they never dared to ask. And what I want..." She looked upward, her gaze piercing the ceiling as though through it she could see the endless stars. "What I want is for the light to rest." The ship trembled violently. The glow of the chamber deepened to crimson, then to white. The air felt heavy with electricity. Somewhere deep within the hull, ancient machinery began to stir, cogs grinding after centuries of stillness. The deck beneath them cracked open, spilling beams of radiance like blood. Valen raised his head, sweat and tears streaking his ash-smeared face. "What are you doing?" "Listening," she said simply. "For the first time, the throne will answer." The sound came first, low, distant, almost imperceptible. A vibration in the hull that resonated through the bones of the ship. It was not mechanical. It was not the hum of reactors or the growl of plasma coils. It was older, deeper. A tone that seemed to come from the very fabric of reality, from the warp beyond the warp, like the echo of something vast turning in its sleep. The chamber lights flickered, shadows writhing along the walls like liquid. Illyra stood perfectly still, eyes closed, lips parted, as if she were listening to a voice only she could hear. Valen could not move. The air pressed against him, heavy and electric, every breath burning his lungs. Around him, the walls began to change again. They were no longer metal but a kind of translucent amber, shifting and rippling with trapped images. Faces. Millions of faces. Men, women, children, soldiers, psychers, screaming silently as if frozen in the moment of death. Their eyes glowed faintly with gold light. He realized, with a terrible clarity, that he was standing inside the memory of the ship. It had recorded every life it had ever taken. Every soul that had burned in its hold had left a mark upon the walls, upon the air, upon the very concept of what the ship was. The mercy of his silence was not merely haunted, it was alive, stitched together from agony and devotion, a reliquary of suffering sanctified by faith. The vibration deepened. The floor beneath him pulsed like a heartbeat. Illyra opened her eyes, and golden tears ran down her cheeks. "Do you hear it, Inquisitor? This is the song that never ends. This is what your Emperor has become." Valen's throat closed. He wanted to shout, to deny, to remind her that the Emperor's will was the only thing keeping humanity from extinction, but the words would not come. Because he did hear it. It was not a song, it was a cry, endless, mournful, and filled with unbearable exhaustion. He recognized the pattern of it. He had heard its rhythm before in the Astronomican's pulse, the beacon that guided ships across the stars. But stripped of distance, stripped of ritual, it was no longer light. It was pain. The beacon was not the Emperor's voice. It was his suffering, amplified across the galaxy. The revelation struck him like a blade. He staggered backward, gripping the nearest wall for balance, but the surface shifted beneath his hand. It was warm, too warm, and it pulsed faintly as if blood flowed through it. His palm left a smear of ash and sweat that glowed faintly before sinking into the wall like a living thing. He recoiled, trembling. Illyra turned toward him, her expression filled with pity and something deeper, an understanding that frightened him more than hate would have. "Now you see," she said softly. "Now you understand why I could not remain silent." "You speak blasphemy," he hissed, though the words lacked conviction. "Without the throne there is nothing. Without him, the warp consumes all." She took a slow step toward him. "And what if that is already true? What if the warp has already consumed him, and all you have been worshipping is the echo of what was left behind?" He shook his head violently, clutching at his chest as though to hold his heart in place. Lies, demonic lies. Her gaze softened further. "Then end me. Call upon your faith, your Emperor, your purity, and strike me down. If what I say is false, he will guide your hand." Valen raised his bolt pistol again, his arm trembling. The weapon's spirit hummed in recognition of its master's intent, chambering around with a click that echoed like thunder in the silence. He aimed for her heart. Her eyes did not waver. Seconds stretched into eternity. The hum grew louder. And in that moment, as his finger tightened on the trigger, he heard another sound. A whisper, faint but undeniable. It came not from Illyra but from everywhere, from the walls, from the air, from within his own mind. "Let her speak." The voice was not hers. It was not the Emperor's either, or not as he had ever imagined it. It was tired, infinite and broken. A whisper from the heart of the throne itself. Valen's arm fell. The pistol slipped from his grasp, clattering against the glowing floor. He dropped to his knees, eyes wide with horror and revelation. "It's true," he breathed. "He lives, but not as we were told." Illyra stepped closer, kneeling before him. "He endures because you make him. Every prayer, every sacrifice, every death feeds the same wound. You think you honor him, but you only keep him from rest." The golden tears fell freely now, evaporating before they touched the ground. "I do not seek to destroy him," she said, "only to let him sleep, to end the hunger." Valen's hands shook as he reached for her, as if touching her might tether him to something real. "And if you do? What becomes of us, of Terra, of all humanity?" She looked past him, her gaze unfocused, seeing something beyond. "Perhaps it ends. Perhaps it begins again. I do not know. I only know the light cannot feed forever." The chamber began to crack, fractures of light spiderwebbing through the walls. The ship groaned, the sound of collapsing gravity tearing at the air. Above them, the ceiling split open, revealing not the cold black of space, but an ocean of gold. It churned and pulsed with impossible light, vast and formless. Within it, for a heartbeat, Valen saw shapes, wings of fire, eyes without number, a face too bright to bear, the Emperor's face, or what was left of it. The voice came again, softer now. "Rest." Then the chamber exploded in silence. The blast did not bring heat or flame. It brought stillness, a crushing, absolute stillness that rolled outward from the shattered chamber like a tide. Time seemed to fracture under its weight. Fragments of light froze in the air, suspended in liquid motion, every shard reflecting the same impossible image. A sky made of gold, vast and trembling. Valen hung in that suspended instant, his body weightless, the sound of his heartbeat impossibly loud in his ears. He thought, fleetingly, that this was death, that he had finally joined the millions who had burned before him. But death was not what came. It was remembrance. The stillness broke. The ship screamed. The walls convulsed, tearing apart in ripples of soundless pressure. Valen crashed to the deck, gasping for breath as gravity reasserted itself. The chamber was gone. In its place stretched a void of light and shadow, a space without dimension, without temperature. He could see stars above him, but they did not shine. They looked like wounds punched through the fabric of reality. The floor beneath him was neither metal nor stone, but something in between, alive and shifting under his weight. He was inside the ship, and yet outside it, as though the mercy of his silence had become an echo of itself, folded into the warp. Illyra floated at the center of that impossible horizon, her form radiant and transparent. She was unraveling. Strands of golden light drifted from her body like silk in a solar wind, dissolving into the void. Each strand that left her form became a star, small, dim, but unmistakably real. A new constellation was forming around her, a halo of quiet fire. She looked down at Valen, and her expression was neither triumphant nor sorrowful. It was peaceful. "You see, now," she said, her voice echoing in the vastness, clear and tender. "It is not death I bring, Inquisitor, it is remembrance." Valen's knees buckled beneath him. He fell forward, palms pressed to the glowing surface. "What have you done?" he rasped. "You're tearing open the veil. You'll damn us all." "No," she murmured. "You damned yourselves long ago. I am only showing you the cost." Around them, the ship's structure began to dissolve, its vast hull turning translucent, its outlines breaking apart like glass submerged in deep water. Through the fragments of its form, Valen saw the images once trapped in its walls, faces of the Psychers, of the faithful, of the forgotten. They were no longer screaming, they were singing. Their voices filled the void in harmonic layers that shimmered through the air like sunlight on water. Every voice carried a single phrase, endless and perfect. "He is not sleeping." The phrase was not despair, it was liberation. It was prayer made whole. Valen pressed his hands to his ears, shaking his head, but the sound was inside him now. Every heartbeat pulsed with their hymn, his faith, his identity, the iron certainty that had carried him through every heresy and horror. All of it cracked under the weight of that sound. "Stop," he whispered, tears cutting clean paths through the grime on his face. "Please, stop." Illyra descended toward him, her body almost gone now, a shape made only of light. When she spoke, it was barely more than a breath. "Do not mourn the light, Inquisitor. It was never ours to keep." He looked up at her, broken and small beneath the golden firmament. "If you end this, if you silence the beacon, they'll die. Every ship lost in the warp, every world without guidance, billions will perish." She smiled faintly, her voice softer than ever. "And yet, perhaps they will live. Not as slaves to a flame that devours them, but as children beneath a sky their own hands will shape." Her hand extended, palm upward. "Come with me, Valen. You have carried the Emperor's silence long enough. Come hear what lies beyond it." For a heartbeat, he almost reached for her. The weight of years pressed down on him, every order, every execution, every pyre he had lit in the name of faith. He had believed that each flame was a prayer, that each death was a service. Now he saw them as echoes of the same hunger that had consumed them all. The thought hollowed him, but habit dies harder than hope. He drew back, shaking his head violently. No, humanity cannot survive the truth. Faith is all we have." "Then it will be enough," she whispered, and her light intensified until it swallowed everything. The sound grew unbearable, yet not painful, like the breaking of an endless chord, the final note of a song sung for 10,000 years. The light surged, brighter and brighter, until the stars themselves seemed to bow before it. Then, silence. When Valen opened his eyes, he was alone. The void was gone. The mercy of his silence hung motionless in real space once more. Her hull cracked but whole, her systems dead. There was no sign of Elira, no trace of the golden constellation, only the cold, indifferent stars staring back at him. He fell to the deck, every muscle shaking. The ship was dark again, but for the first time in his life, the silence did not frighten him. The mercy of his silence drifted for an age unmeasured, a carcass upon the void. Her lights had gone out long ago, her engines cold, her Vox arrays silent. No astropath answered her call. No prayer reached beyond her broken hull. Yet, within her shadowed corridors, something still lived. It was not life as men knew it, nor death, but the quiet persistence of memory, an echo that refused to fade. Arctan Valen moved through that memory like a ghost. Time had lost its meaning. The air recyclers no longer sang, the chronometers no longer pulsed. The only sound that remained was the dull, rhythmic thud of his heart. He wandered the ship as though it were a tomb, tracing the path of what had been. Sometimes he found the remains of servitors, their skulls tilted upward as if in prayer. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps following behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing. Only the shadows shifting with the breath of a dying machine. He should have died. He knew that. Perhaps he already had, and this was the afterlife that awaited the faithful, a ship adrift in silence, too holy to perish, too cursed to find peace. And yet, deep inside him, a spark remained: duty, faith, regret. They bled together until he could no longer tell where one ended and another began. It was in the navigator's sanctum that he found the first sign of her again. The chamber was cracked and warped, its walls rippling with faint gold veins that pulsed in rhythm with something deep within the hull. The navigator's throne lay empty, its occupant reduced to ash long ago, but the third-eye visor still glimmered faintly on the floor beside it. Valen picked it up with trembling hands, brushing dust from the polished glass. When he looked through it, the world changed. The walls dissolved, revealing the warp beyond. No longer the howling tempest of madness and color he had always known, but something softer. It shimmered like mist, threaded through with faint bands of gold light. He could see figures moving within it, human shapes, blurred and translucent, drifting without fear or form. They did not scream, they did not burn, they simply were. He lowered the visor, his breath ragged. For the first time in his life, he felt the warp without terror. It was vast, unknowable, but not malevolent. It felt like the pause after breath, the moment between heartbeat and heartbeat. A silence that waited to be filled. He staggered back, whispering to himself, "What have you done?" Her voice answered from everywhere and nowhere. "I gave them rest." He turned, and there she was. Not solid, not flesh, but light shaped into a woman's form. She stood where the navigator's throne had once been, her body woven from gold mist. Her face was calm, radiant, but her edges flickered like a candle fighting to remain lit. "You still live," he breathed. "No," she said gently. "Not as I once did. I am what remains of them, all of them. The ship carries our echo now, and I guide it." He wanted to curse her, to demand that she undo what she had done, but the words died in his throat. There was no wrath in her, no arrogance, only exhaustion and an impossible tenderness. "You don't understand," he whispered. "The throne will fade. Without its light, the Imperium will fall. Every world, every life will be lost to the dark." She looked past him, through the cracked hull and into the infinite. "And what will you call the dark then, Inquisitor? When all your light is built on screams?" He flinched as though struck. The question hung between them, heavy and terrible. He thought of the millions who had burned to keep the beacon alive, of the worlds that had been sacrificed to keep faith from crumbling. He thought of the Emperor himself, entombed in machinery, neither alive nor dead, his name turned into a weapon of obedience. "You can't end him," Valen said. "You can't end the only thing that holds us together." "I cannot end what already ended," she replied softly. "I can only let go of what remains." The ship groaned. Outside, the warp shifted. The faint gold light beyond the hull began to fade, replaced by the cold blue shimmer of real space. The Mercy had drifted back into the void of stars. Valen sank to his knees, staring through the cracked viewport. He could see Terra faintly, a distant glimmer of light upon the horizon. The Astronomicon still burned, bright and steady. The Emperor still endured. But now he could hear the tone beneath that brilliance, the cry he had heard in the chamber, stretched thin across the stars, still begging for silence. He lowered his head. "You failed," he said quietly. "No," she murmured, her form flickering like static. I reminded him that he can still dream. Valen remained kneeling long after the vision faded, the cold hum of the dead ship vibrating faintly through his bones. Outside, the stars drifted with mechanical stillness, the kind of beauty that mocked belief. He remembered those stars from childhood, tiny, eternal pinpricks of light seen through the dust haze of a shrine world's night sky. He had been told then that each one was a promise of his watchful gaze, a reminder that no matter how far humanity strayed, the Emperor's light would always find them. But here, surrounded by the relics of faith turned to ruin, he saw that promise for what it was, not salvation but surveillance. Every star was another eye that could not close. He tried to rise, but his legs failed. The body that had endured the flames of battle, the void's freezing grasp, and psychic storms now trembled under the weight of a truth too vast to bear. Illyra's words coiled in his skull. I reminded him that he can still dream. What did that mean? What dream could possibly belong to something that had been half dead for 10,000 years? He wanted to laugh, but it came out as a broken gasp. The visor slipped from his hands and shattered, against the floor. Through the fractured glass, he glimpsed fleeting images, flashes of gold, the faces of the Psychers, the endless tide of souls that had passed through the throne's fire. And then, something new, a shape of light, vast and undefined, standing upon a plain of stars. It looked like a man, and yet not a man, formed entirely from radiance and silence. For a heartbeat, it seemed to turn its head toward him. He felt it see him. Then the shards went dark. He forced himself to stand, gripping the wall for balance. If he dreams, he whispered to the emptiness, then he remembers. And if he remembers, he may awaken. A faint light flickered in response, running through the veins of the ship like blood awakening in frozen veins. Illyra's voice came again, fainter now, echoing from everywhere. He stirs, but not as you hope. His dream is not your redemption, it is your reflection. He stumbled toward the nearest passageway following the glow. "Show me," he rasped. "If he dreams, let me see what he sees." The corridor unfolded ahead of him like a wound opening in the dark. The walls shimmered with scenes that bled from one to another. images so vast and intimate they made his heart seize. He saw Terra, its spires like thorns against the horizon, its air thick with incense and smoke. He saw the golden throne, immense beyond reason, its cables and conduits stretching into infinity. And upon that throne he saw the shape of a man, bound, burned, unmoving. His eyes were closed, but light poured from every fracture in his skin. The sound that filled the vision was not speech, but the endless exhale of something both living and decaying. And then, within that brilliance, Valen saw himself. He stood at the foot of the throne, a child again, head bowed, reciting the catechisms of obedience. Behind him stood billions, repeating the same words in perfect unison, their voices merging into one endless litany. The light consumed them all, leaving only ashes that still whispered prayers. He fell to his knees again, gasping. The vision shattered. The ship was dark once more. Illyra's voice drifted to him through the static of the void. "Do you see now? Even gods can be prisoners of faith. You built his cage from love and fear and called it worship." Valen pressed his hands to his head, shaking. "If what you say is true," he murmured, "then there's nothing left. No emperor, no hope, only the void." "Not nothing," she said. Her voice had softened to the faintest whisper. "There is still the dream, and the dream remembers what you have forgotten." He lifted his eyes. The viewport ahead showed Terra's distant light, the golden flicker of the Astronomicon still pulsing. But now he could see that it wavered, just slightly, like a heartbeat slowing after exhaustion. Somewhere within that pulse, he felt an emotion he had never associated with the divine: sorrow. The ship trembled. A low vibration ran through its hull, the kind that precedes an awakening or a collapse. The lumen panels flickered one by one, illuminating the corridor ahead in a path of uncertain gold. Illyra's voice echoed from that direction, gentler now, almost pleading. "Come, there is one thing more to see." He followed. The corridor led him to the observation sanctum, once reserved for telepathica overseers. The glass dome above had fractured, yet still held atmosphere, shimmering faintly with a thin veil of containment energy. Through it stretched the void, and, at its heart, Terra. The homeworld gleamed faintly in the distance, haloed by the soft haze of its own light pollution. Around it, thousands of ships burned in slow orbits. Pilgrims, war barges, supply freighters, all guided by the same beacon he had once called holy. As he watched, one of those lights flickered and went out, then another, and another. A cold certainty filled his stomach. The Astronomicon was weakening. "You've doomed them," he whispered. "No," said Illyra's fading voice. "I've freed them. When the light fades, they will see the stars as they truly are. They will learn to walk without the leash." He bowed his head, tears hot on his face. "And if they fall, then they will fall by their own will. And that is a kind of grace your Imperium has forgotten." Her light dimmed. The golden veins in the walls began to dull, retreating into shadow. The ship's hum slowed, became gentle, almost tranquil. Valen stayed there, staring through the fractured dome at the dying light of Terra, whispering a prayer he no longer believed in. For the first time in his life, he prayed not for salvation, but for silence. The stars beyond the cracked dome seemed closer now, as if the universe itself were leaning in to listen. Valen stood unmoving before the viewport, his reflection faintly superimposed upon the dying light of Terra. The warp shimmered faintly around the planet, a golden haze thinning at its edges, pulsing slower and slower like a great heart losing strength. He had spent his entire life drawing strength from that light. Now, as he watched it fade, he felt not fear, but an aching calm, a serenity he could not name. The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon, yet cleaner than any confession. "Illyra," he whispered, though he knew she might not answer. "What becomes of a galaxy that no longer believes?" The answer came slowly, rising from the floor plates, from the air, from the breath of the ship itself. "It begins again." Her voice was faint now, disembodied, woven through the hum of dying systems. Faith was the fire that lit the long night, but fire always hungers. It was never meant to last forever. What endures must learn to see without burning. He turned toward the sound, following it through the darkened sanctum. His boots echoed against the metal deck, the noise swallowed by the vastness around him. Shadows flickered across the walls, fragments of memory replaying themselves in bursts of gold and white. He saw images of the Psychers as they had once been, men and women chained, trembling, their faces turned upward toward a light they could never see. He saw the servitors, blank-eyed and obedient, dragging their charges toward the chambers of consumption. He saw himself among them, reciting the rites, believing every word. Now those images trembled, fading into something else. The same faces unbound, the same voices, rising in harmony rather than pain. The same fire, but no longer devouring. It was light now, gentle, cool, infinite. He reached the end of the corridor. A single door remained open, leading into the ship's heart. Inside, the psychic conduits glowed with a faint luminescence, no longer raging but pulsing like veins carrying lifeblood through a sleeping body. At the center stood a console, its screens dim, the controls fractured and warped. Upon it lay a single object, a data slate, cracked but still active. The glow from its runes pulsed softly, drawing him nearer. He touched the screen and it flared to life. Streams of text scrolled across the display, records, transmissions, fragments of thought. They were not mechanical logs, but impressions, feelings, memories burned into the machine's cortex. He realized, with slow horror, that he was reading the ship's dreams. "I hear them. The children of light, they do not cry anymore. The void is quiet, the throne is still. The fire sleeps, the words faded, replaced by new ones. He does not speak, but I feel him. He drifts, he remembers. The dream is wide." Valen's breath caught. The golden light from the walls pulsed once, faintly, in response to his heartbeat. He pressed his palm to the console and the ship spoke again, not in words, but in images pouring directly into his mind. He saw the throne on Terra, still burning, still alive, but its light was flickering. Within that radiance, the shape upon the throne stirred ever so slightly, a movement so small it might have been an illusion. The air around him shimmered with the memory of wings. The Emperor's eyes remained closed. Yet for one heartbeat, Valen felt the weight of that gaze upon him, a presence immeasurable, boundless, but weary beyond comprehension. It was not wrath he felt, nor command. It was sorrow. The sorrow of a man chained to eternity by those who loved him too deeply to let him die. Tears welled in Valen's eyes. "We did this," he whispered. "We made you suffer because we could not imagine a world without you." The presence flickered, like acknowledgement. Then it was gone. He sank to his knees before the console, his mind spiraling between awe and grief. The golden glow dimmed again, leaving only the faint hum of power beneath his hands. The ship seemed to sigh, the kind of sound one makes in sleep after pain begins to fade. Illyra's voice returned one final time, a whisper barely above the breath of the void. "He dreams still, Arctan Valen, and through him so will you. Remember this. Silence is not the absence of faith, It is the space where it may grow anew. He closed his eyes, resting his head against the console. "And you?" he asked softly. "What becomes of you now?" The air shimmered. He thought he saw her face one last time. Faint, radiant, fading like dawn. "I was never meant to remain," she said. "I was the question, nothing more." Her light dissolved, scattering into dust that hung suspended in the air like the remnants of a dying star. Volin reached out, but it passed through his fingers. The glow sank into the floor, into the ship, until the entire vessel seemed to exhale. A long, weary sigh that echoed through the void. Outside, the warp shimmered. The mercy of his silence began to move again, not under power but carried by unseen currents, gliding silently toward Terra's distant glow. Volin watched it drift through the viewport, the world of mankind shining faintly on the horizon. He no longer knew whether what awaited them was salvation or ruin. Perhaps there was no difference anymore. He whispered to the darkness, "May you dream, my Emperor. May you rest." And the void, vast and endless, whispered back, "He is not sleeping." The voice faded into the bones of the ship, into the faint echo of engines that no longer burned. The words lingered like the last vibration of a struck bell. "He is not sleeping." Valen stood alone in the observation sanctum, the endless ocean of stars reflecting in his visor like cold fire. The mercy of his silence drifted onward, following no course, guided by no hand. Yet the ship moved with purpose, as though something unseen had laid a path for it through the void. He had not slept in what felt like days, though time aboard the derelict had long since dissolved. Hunger no longer touched him, nor thirst. The machinery that had once served the living now hummed softly, sustaining him in ways he did not understand. It was as though the ship itself refused to let him die. He began to wonder if he was still entirely human, or something between flesh and echo, preserved to bear witness. Perhaps that was his punishment, or perhaps his calling. The stars ahead began to shift. The view warped, the familiar constellations bending, rearranging themselves into a pattern he almost recognized. A halo of golden light bloomed at the edge of perception, faint but unmistakable. Terra, the heart of the Imperium, the birthplace of both salvation and damnation. Even from this distance, the Astronomican's pulse reached him, faltering, diminished, yet still alive, still burning. He felt it in his teeth, in his blood, in the scarred marrow of his faith. The same rhythm that had once filled the minds of psychers across the galaxy now beat within him, slow and uneven. He realized, with a quiet horror, that he was no longer merely hearing the Emperor's beacon. He was part of it. Illyra's whisper rose, again, distant now, more memory than voice. "You are the Echo, Arcton. What was once taken from the living is now given to the lost." He pressed a hand to his chest. His heartbeat matched the pulse of the Astronomican exactly. The revelation came not as fear, but as understanding. She had not destroyed the light, she had fractured it, divided it among those who had carried its burden, the psychers, the ships, even him. The Emperor's suffering was no longer bound entirely to the throne. It was diffused, spread thin through every soul capable of remembrance. The flame was no longer a single inferno, but a constellation of embers scattered through the galaxy. And still, it endured. He moved through the ship, drawn by instinct toward the lower decks. The corridors had changed again. What had once been twisted metal and decay now looked reborn. The walls were smooth, clean, faintly luminous. No corpses, no blood, only silence and the faint hum of unseen life. The air carried the scent of ozone and incense, the mingled aroma of sanctity and aftermath. He walked slowly, reverently, afraid to break the fragile balance of peace that hung there. He passed through a door that should not have existed, a narrow arch of polished brass engraved with sigils of the Inquisition, their edges melted by some unseen heat. Beyond it lay a chamber that glowed with a soft, steady light. At its center stood an altar, plain and unadorned. Upon it rested a single object, the broken chain that had once bound Illyra Voss. It shimmered faintly, as though alive, its links resonating in time with the dying pulse of the Astronomicon. Valen approached, his breath shallow. He reached out, fingertips brushing the cool metal. The instant he touched it, warmth flooded through him. Memories that were not his own. He saw the harvests, the ships, the endless sacrifices that had kept the light alive. But he also saw something else. Moments of tenderness hidden between the horror. The laughter of children born aboard the black ships before they were taken. The quiet prayers of captains who wept after sealing their holds. The soft voices of the condemned forgiving their captors before the fire consumed them. He saw her again, standing before the throne in a place no living soul had ever reached. She did not kneel, she did not speak. She only placed her hand upon the dying light and whispered a single word that echoed across eternity. Rest. The image dissolved, leaving him trembling. The chain lay still. The warmth lingered. He sank to his knees before the altar, the air around him thick with unseen gravity. "Illyra," he whispered, voice cracking. "You've given him peace, haven't you? Not freedom, not death, just a moment's peace." The silence that followed was not empty. It was vast, patient, endless. It filled every corner of the ship, pressing gently against his thoughts. And within that stillness he understood. The Astronomicon's flicker was not failure. It was breath, the slow exhale of something finally allowed to rest. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor of mankind was dreaming, not suffering. Valen bowed his head, and the tears that came were not of grief but gratitude. "Then let the dream endure," he murmured. "Let it carry us as far as it will." The ship shuddered softly, as if in acknowledgement. The stars outside flared one by one, the warp currents folding around the vessel in golden streams. The mercy of his silence turned its broken prow toward the light of Terra, and began its long journey home. Valen stood, his hand still resting on the chain. The weight of faith no longer crushed him. It sustained him. The silence was no longer an absence. It was a hymn too deep for words. He looked once more toward the stars, and though the void stretched infinite before him, he no longer felt lost within it. The mercy of his silence breached the veil of real space like a relic returning from myth. The warp peeled away from her hull in shreds of gold and black, dissolving into the vacuum as the ship emerged within the Sol system. Terra lay ahead, a wounded jewel suspended in endless dark, its surface shrouded in clouds of incense and pollution, its orbit crowded with the glittering silhouettes of orbital cathedrals and fortress stations. Vox beacons flickered faintly across the system's edge, their tones erratic, strained, as if uncertain whether to greet this ghost or flee it. For a long moment, the ship drifted without answering any hail. The automated defense grids registered her transponder, recognized the sigils of the Inquisition and the sanction marks of the Astra Telepathica, and then froze, unable to classify her living. The silence extended until even the machine spirits of the orbitals began to whisper among themselves, their binary prayers corrupted with unease. Then, softly, a pulse rippled through the void. It was not a transmission in any known frequency, but something deeper, felt, not heard. The same pulse echoed through every listening soul in the system, a rhythm faint and vast, like the slow heartbeat of a god in slumber. Arctan Valen stood upon the observation deck, his hands clasped behind his back. His armor was broken, his robes burned, yet his posture remained that of an inquisitor, unyielding, deliberate, composed even at the edge of revelation. The stars of the Emperor's domain burned before him, unaltered and eternal. Yet he knew now how fragile that eternity truly was. The light of the Astronomicon still flared across the void, visible even through the viewports, a golden wound in the sky. But it was different now, softer, quieter, no longer the desperate blaze of agony sustained by sacrifice. It pulsed like a heartbeat, slow and steady, as though something immense had finally drawn breath. Behind him, the ship whispered, not through Vox, not through systems, but through the quiet hum of consciousness that now lived within its metal bones. The Mercy was awake, though she no longer spoke in words. She remembered, and she carried her dead with grace. The corridors glowed faintly, as though lit from within by the ghosts of all who had burned aboard her. Valen turned from the viewport and began his slow walk toward the shuttle bay. He had made his choice during the long drift home. The galaxy would not be told what had happened here. No one would believe it, and those who did would die to keep it secret. The ecclesiarchy would call it heresy. The Inquisition would call it madness. Yet he carried within him the truth like a spark he dared not let die. When he reached the docking bay, the doors parted without command. A single shuttle awaited him, a small craft, its hull painted with the faded sigil of the black ships. The servitors that should have tended it stood motionless, their heads bowed, their circuits glowing, faintly gold. They did not move as he passed. As he stepped aboard, a familiar voice drifted through the ship's vox, a whisper like distant wind. "You return to the fire," it said. He closed his eyes. "It is where I began, and perhaps where I end." "You cannot end," she murmured. "You are the echo now." He opened his eyes, his voice soft. "Then, let the echo serve." The engines ignited, and the shuttle drifted free of the Mercy's hull. For a moment he looked back. The great ship floated in stillness, her silhouette haloed by the faint shimmer of gold dust. She no longer looked like a vessel of death, but like a tomb sanctified by peace. Then he turned toward Terra. The light of the Astronomicon bathed his craft as he entered the planet's shadow. He could see the vast shape of the Imperial Palace now, a mountain of black stone and gold, its towers rising into the heavens, its surface glowing with the faint shimmer of atmospheric shields. It had not changed. It never changed. As he descended, his vox crackled with the automated litanies of the defense networks. His identity codes, ancient, unquestionable, still granted him passage. The storm of bureaucracy, the web of authority, all bent to that single sigil on his armor, the inquisitorial high. The gate opened. The shuttle descended through clouds thick with incense smoke. Lightning flickered between spires of obsidian and gold. The ground below was a labyrinth of temples, manufactoria, and habitation hives, all surrounding the palace like organs encircling a heart. Even from above, he could see the flicker of the pilgrims' torches. Millions of souls crawling toward the gates each day, praying for a glimpse of light that would never look back. He landed in silence upon the platform reserved for the Ordo's most secret envoys. No one greeted him. No one questioned him. Perhaps they sensed what he carried. Perhaps they were wise enough not to ask. He walked through the halls alone, his footsteps echoing against marble inlaid with gold. The air was heavy with incense and the faint metallic tang of sanctified machinery. Deeper he went, through wards older than memory, through tunnels carved by the labor of generations. He passed the great statues of the custodian guard, their faces masked, their weapons raised in eternal vigil. He passed the silent choir of the astropaths, their hollow eyes lifted toward the ceiling as they mouthed words that were no longer theirs. And then, finally, he stood before the gate of waking light. It was larger than any cathedral, its surface carved with 1,000 wings, 1,000 eyes. Behind it lay the throne. Behind it lay the reason for everything. Valen fell to one knee. His armor creaked. His voice came low and trembling. "I have returned, Lord of mankind. I have seen the shadow of your dream. I have heard the silence between your breaths." The gate remained still, but he could feel it. The same pulse that had guided him through, the void, slow, patient, alive. He bowed his head and whispered, "If you can hear me, rest. Just rest." The silence that followed was total, profound. Then, from behind the gate, a single sound answered, a heartbeat. The sound rolled through the chamber like thunder wrapped in reverence. It was not the clamor of machinery nor the rhythmic pulse of the great life support engines that had groaned for millennia beneath the throne. It was something deeper. Flesh, not metal. A heartbeat. Slow. Relentless. Terrible in its intimacy. It reverberated through the marble, through the bones of the palace, through the marrow of Arcton Valen himself. He fell forward, his palms slamming against the floor as the vibration surged up his arms. He felt it in his chest, a second pulse aligning with his own, stealing its rhythm, replacing it. The air grew heavy with warmth, thick as incense. The lumen globes flickered, casting long shadows across the engraved walls. For the first time since the day he had been sworn into the Inquisition, Valen felt the certainty of his faith return, but not as comfort, as awe. He raised his head. The gate of waking light shimmered faintly, its wings trembling as though moved by a wind that did not exist. The golden script along its frame glowed brighter, the old sigils of the Mechanicum and the Ecclesiarchy intertwining in motion. Alive. He saw them shift, merge, become something new, patterns no Lex Mechanic had ever recorded. He thought he saw a shape behind the gate, vast and formless, a light too pure to gaze upon directly. "Illyra," he whispered, his voice breaking. "What have you done?" Her voice did not answer. Instead, the heartbeat deepened. The sound became a chorus, soft voices rising in harmony with the pulse. Not angels, not the choir of the living. It was the sound of the dead, the psychers, the servants, the lost. They were singing, and the song was wordless. It was the hum of existence, the vibration of meaning itself. He felt the throne awaken, not violently, not in grandeur, but like an ancient god stirring beneath a shroud of centuries. The light from beneath the gate spilled across the floor, thin and gold, tracing toward him like the touch of dawn. He should have recoiled. He should have screamed the rites of exorcism, called for the custodes, activated the wards, but instead he bowed his head lower. The tears that spilled down his face glowed faintly in the reflected light. "I came to serve," he said, barely audible. "And now I understand how little I knew what service meant." The light touched him, and it was not fire. It was warmth, gentle, familiar. It moved across his skin like the breath of a dying sun, leaving no pain, only clarity. Images flooded his mind again, the mercy of his silence. The psychers' faces illuminated in golden peace, Illyra's hand resting upon the core, her whisper echoing across time. Then another image, a throne not of gold, but of light, empty, waiting. He staggered to his feet. "You're leaving," he murmured, realizing the truth as it formed. "You're letting go." The light brightened in answer, flooding the hall. The heartbeat quickened once, twice, then steadied again. He could feel the boundaries between life and death, matter and spirit, warp and flesh, softening. The throne was not dying, it was transforming. The Emperor was no longer bound to it. What he had been was diffusing, spreading outward through every ember of consciousness still capable of belief. Faith was no longer centralized, it was becoming universal. Valen stood trembling before the gate, his mind reeling with comprehension too vast to contain. The ecclesiarchs would never understand this. The Inquisition would destroy anyone who even spoke of it. And yet here he was, witness to the truth that had sustained the Imperium for 10,000 years. The Emperor was not a god chained to a seat. He was a dream shared by billions, made real through their devotion, and at last he was dreaming freely. The voices behind the gate shifted. For a moment they became words, soft, human words. "Walk with me." Valen's breath caught. The chamber blurred as his vision flooded with gold. He reached out a trembling hand toward the gate. The moment his fingers brushed the light, everything else vanished. The hall, the sound, the world. He stood upon a plane of impossible radiance. The sky above was not sky but the warp itself, quiet and still, painted with rivers of color that no eye could name. Before him stood a figure, not towering, not adorned in armor but simple, human. A man in golden robes, his face illuminated by the light of uncountable suns. The eyes that met Valen's were tired, infinite, and kind. The Inquisitor fell to his knees, unable to breathe. The words left him unbidden. "My lord, forgive me." The figure's expression was neither judgment nor forgiveness. It was something deeper. Understanding. "You served as you were taught," said the voice, not through sound, but through the totality of being. "Now serve as you were meant to." Valen lifted his gaze, though it blinded him. "How?" "Remember." The word was a command, a benediction, a gift. The figure raised its hand, and the world dissolved in light. When Valen opened his eyes again, he was kneeling before the gate of waking light. The glow had faded. The chamber was silent. But within that silence, he felt it, the dream continuing, not here, but everywhere. He rose slowly, his body aching, his heart steady. For the first time, he felt no need to pray. The prayer was already within him. The air that followed was clean and hollow, a vacuum of sound so complete that even his breath seemed hesitant to exist. Arcton Valen remained kneeling, his gauntleted hands pressed against the cold marble, the echo of that word still reverberating through the lattice of his thoughts. Remember. It did not fade. It branched. It took root. He lifted his head. The gate of waking light no longer shimmered. It stood silent, immutable, as though it had never moved at all. Yet the air bore a charge that was unmistakable. It was the scent that precedes a storm, the feeling of pressure, the trembling anticipation of release. Valen inhaled deeply, and for the first time he smelled life here. Not oil, not incense, not the sterile breath of machines, life, raw and unprocessed. Humanity's scent. He rose slowly to his feet. The chamber stretched before him, massive beyond comprehension, the ceiling disappearing into shadow. He walked forward until his fingers brushed the surface of the gate. The metal was warm to the touch, humming faintly with the residue of something far beyond mortal reckoning. He could sense the trace of what had transpired, the Emperor's presence, Illyra's echo, and his own memory now fused into a single thread of continuity. The realization filled him with a stillness so deep it bordered on terror. He turned. The long hall behind him was empty, lit only by the soft afterglow of the gate. The custodes were gone, the air devoid of guards or priests or ceremony. It was as if the palace itself had exhaled, releasing every witness but him. He understood then that this moment, this fragile intersection of divinity and humanity, was not meant to be seen, it was meant to be felt. The Imperium would continue as it always had, praying, building, burning, fighting. The machinery of faith would grind on, but somewhere in its depths, something had changed, and he was the only one who knew. He walked slowly through the passageway that led away from the throne chamber. The torches along the walls ignited one by one as he passed, not with the white fire of purification but with the golden hue of sunrise. Each flame whispered faintly in its own tongue, a susurration of memory, the sound of the countless lives that had sustained the Emperor's dream. They did not ask for worship, they asked only to be remembered. Volin's mind drifted as he walked, replaying what he had seen within that impossible light. The figure that had stood before him, was it truly the Emperor, or only the shape his mind could endure? The question no longer mattered. What mattered was what the figure had become. No longer a prisoner of machinery, no longer the devourer of souls. The Emperor had transcended the cage built around him, not by strength, but through surrender. His dream now coursed through the warp itself, through the psychers and the faithful alike, not as chains, but as echoes of freedom. The Astronomican's light still shone, but it was no longer a beacon of suffering. It was a heartbeat of hope. He reached the outer corridors of the palace, where the walls were carved from obsidian veined with gold. The silence here was different, alive with potential. He could hear the faint murmur of pilgrims outside, millions gathered at the base of the mountain, their prayers carried upward in tides of belief. For centuries he had despised that sound, empty repetition, ritual without understanding, but now it reached him like music. Every voice was a fragment of something vast, unmeasured, imperfect, and beautiful. He stopped before a massive window overlooking the world below. The sky was gray with ash and faith smoke, the light of the Astronomican piercing it in long, trembling rays. The city stretched outward in endless sprawl, hives and manufactoria rising like teeth from a wound. Yet somewhere in that maze, children laughed, workers sang, lovers whispered their defiance to the night. The Imperium was broken, yes, but it lived. Volin rested his hand against the glass. He dreams through them, he murmured, through every soul that refuses to die. The reflection staring back at him was not the man who had boarded the mercy of his silence. His eyes were clearer, his face thinner, his armor dimmed of its luster. The sigil of the Inquisition burned faintly upon his chest plate, its lines softened, almost humanized by the golden glow. He realized then that he could not return to his old role. The Ordos would not understand. They would name him heretic, exile, demon kin. They would silence him before his words could seed doubt. He smiled faintly, then let them. His reflection smiled back, serene and unafraid. Truth does not require belief to endure. He turned from the window and began the long walk down the hall. His footsteps were steady, unhurried. As he moved, the light followed him, dimming behind and blooming ahead, as though the palace itself bowed in quiet recognition of what had passed. Outside, the Astronomican pulsed once, bright, immense, and for a fleeting moment every astropath on Terra wept without knowing why. The signal was clearer than it had been in centuries, stripped of distortion, its message pure and unadorned. Not command, not warning, a whisper. Be still. Valen closed his eyes. The whisper filled him, echoed through the dying circuits of the galaxy, through every ship adrift in the void, through every prayer cast into the dark. The Imperium endured, yes, but now it breathed. The dawn above Terra was unlike any dawn that had come before. The clouds that had long hidden the sky parted, not by wind or machine, but by something unseen. A tremor in the air, a sigh from the bones of the world itself. For the first time in millennia, sunlight broke across the spires of the Imperial Palace, unfiltered by the smog of devotion. The light that spilled down was golden and gentle, like memory made manifest. It touched the statues of saints and martyrs, the towers of the Administratum, the rusted domes of forgotten manufactoria, and even the slums where children carved the Aquila into the dust. For one impossible hour, the world did not weep. Arcton Valen stood upon the palace's upper parapet, the wind pulling at his torn robes. Below, the city stretched like an ocean, its endless hives, its furnace glow, its ceaseless prayers rising into the air like smoke. Yet for once, that smoke did not choke the stars. He could see them clearly now, faint and fragile in the dawn, the constellations of mankind's endurance. He watched them shimmer, and he felt the faint pulse in his chest answering theirs. The Astronomicon still burned, but now it felt alive, like the steady breathing of something healed but not yet whole. He no longer carried his rosette of authority. It lay behind him on the marble railing, the sigil of the Inquisition cracked neatly in two. He had left it there deliberately, a confession and an absolution in one. He no longer spoke for the Imperium. He no longer hunted heresy. The truth he had seen transcended law, doctrine, and obedience alike. To speak it aloud would invite only war, and humanity had no strength left for another holy war. Some truths must live in silence. Some revelations must bloom slowly through the quiet evolution of the soul. He turned his gaze toward the horizon. The void ships that circled Terra gleamed faintly, their hulls reflecting the newborn light. He could sense the astropaths aboard them stirring, hearing not orders, not pain, but peace. Across the galaxy, those attuned to the Astronomicon would feel it too, the change, subtle yet undeniable. The beacon no longer devoured, it invited. It called not the terrified and the bound, but the willing. It sang not of fear, but of return. He thought of Illyra Voss, of her final moment before the ship had become light, of her words echoing in his mind like scripture written in breath. Silence is not absence. It is the space where faith may grow anew. He felt her presence still, not as ghost nor vision, but as part of the vast harmony that now surrounded him. She was in the song of the engines that carried refugees through the void, in the prayers whispered by those who still believed, in the quiet between the Emperor's heartbeats. She had become what she was always meant to be, a bridge between faith and freedom. Valen bowed his head. "You were right," he whispered. "We feared the dark because we never looked long enough to see the stars inside it." The wind answered with a low hum, threading through the broken sigil of his rosette, scattering its fragments across the marble. They fell like dull coins and were caught by the breeze, tumbling into the abyss below. He looked once more toward the throne tower, the colossal silhouette that dominated the skyline, its golden surface alive with faint luminescence. The light had softened. It no longer burned like the sun, but glowed like the memory of dawn reflected on water. For a long moment, he thought he saw movement upon its surface, a shimmer, as though the stone itself had taken breath. He did not need proof. He knew what it meant. The Emperor was dreaming, and through that dream, humanity had been given a second chance. He turned his eyes to the heavens, to the ships departing, Terra's orbit. Somewhere among them would be a new generation, Captains, pilgrims, scholars, children, who would never know the horrors of the black ships as he had. The old Imperium would continue to grind forward, yes, but something beneath it had changed forever. The wheel of faith had shifted by a single degree, and in that infinitesimal tilt lay the possibility of mercy. He felt the pulse again in his chest, a rhythm that matched the stars. It was not divine, not supernatural. It was simply alive. He closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer, not to the Emperor as God, but to the dream that had once borne his name. May we learn to walk without burning the sky. For a time, he stood there in silence, feeling the sun's warmth on his face. Then he turned and walked away from the parapet, leaving the broken symbol of his old life behind. The echo of his footsteps faded into the stillness of the palace corridors, into the pulse of the waking world. Far above, in the vault of the heavens, the Astronomicon flared once, bright enough to be seen even from the dead worlds of the rim. To some, it was only a fluctuation, a distortion in the endless hum of the warp. To others, it was an omen, a sign of things yet to come. But for one heartbeat, just one, the light of the Emperor's beacon flickered in rhythm with the stars themselves, not as a command, not as a call to war, as a heartbeat shared across the void. And somewhere in the infinite silence that followed, the whisper came again, vast and tender, carrying across every corner of the Imperium. He is not sleeping.